Okay. Hi, everyone. Well, here we are. Another week gone by. Feels like it just melted away from the universe. I don't know about you, but I feel like we were here chatting like just yesterday, even though it was pretty much exactly a week ago. But despite time having no meaning, something wonderful happened the other week that made my heart explode. The baby played with other babies. We've been trying to connect with these two other families in our area who have babies about the same age as ours, but of course we've had to like go through this whole process of making sure we're all on the same page when it comes to how we're dealing with COVID-19. Things like how frequently do you go out? Do you always wear a mask? Does your job require you to work in person? Like all that kind of stuff. It's like an interview process. Anyways, we finally got to the point where we were all on the same page, but when it came time for the babies to play, ours was incredibly shy and anxious, which makes sense, given that she's had like so little social interaction with humans who don't directly share her genetics. But this last time, she was super into playing with them. She was also super chatty and demonstrated how good she is at throwing balls. Which made me proud. I taught her how to throw balls when we were in Michigan visiting some family, and I'd give her a ping pong ball. She'd toss it, I'd catch it, rinse, wash, and repeat. So she was the only baby who knew how to throw a ball. So they set up their own sort of like system where she'd throw it, the other baby would grab it, rinse, wash, and repeat. And I have to admit, seeing her able to interact with other babies is like a major weight off my chest because, I was starting to get really worried that she'd start to develop some kind of pathological anxiety just because of this thoroughly stupid time in which we're living in this country for absolutely no justifiable reason. Anyways, speaking of the perception of time and how it is we can even perceive time, there are a few studies that came out this past week that I found pretty interesting, and some were sort of like hardcore neuroscience-y, while some were a bit more associated with psychology, I suppose, though, the psychology E1 absolutely characterizes what we can speculate as being a function of hardwired anatomical associations between like sensory and limbic systems. But we'll start with the more hardcore neuroscience-y one. So how is it that our brains encode a sense of the passage of time? And to be totally open, this group used a technique that I didn't end up using very frequently. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, so, better known as fMRI, which you can see here. So it is, in short, a technology that enables us to see changes in how much oxygen delivered by blood, of course, regions around the brain are burning like fuel about every 2 seconds or so. And so, since neurons, the main brain cell that can handle rapid signaling, the kind of signaling that would be important for something like time perception, the neurons consume a ton of caloric energy, which is, again, delivered by blood. So this can give us a sense of where in the brain neurons are particularly active every few seconds. And it varies a bit between different systems, but to give you a sense of what fMRI data look like, you can get a sense here. So as you might be able to tell, it's sort of like a blurry image of the brain. That's sort of the trade-off of using fMRI. But what we're seeing is a horizontal section. So in this case, it's like if you were to take a slice of the brain from your forehead to the back of your brain, and that's parallel to the ground, right? And then you can see like sort of orange and red areas, sort of blobs. Those are areas where more energy is being consumed in the brain, which likely correlates to increased neuronal activity in the moment that they took this snapshot image. And on this image, it looks like they were probably detecting either some kind of visual stimulus that's eliciting activity in the occipital lobe in the back there. But I don't know, from what study that this image is derived. But one of the most attractive aspects of this technology is that humans can be studied because, all you have to do is have a person lie down in that gigantic donut on the bottom there, no surgery or anything like that, no implanting electrodes, anything like that. So very useful technology. So that's what this study was using to probe time perception, fMRI. And so this group at UC Berkeley in California, in collaboration with the group at Osaka University in Japan, specifically probed how it is that we develop a sense of the passage of time in like very small durations. So the short story is that this group found neurons in the supramarginal gyrus, or SMG, that seem to fire in response to specific lengths of time. And so if a person is exposed to a stimulus repeatedly, at the exact same intervals, like a blink of light or a beep or something like that, every couple hundred milliseconds, the neurons would begin to fatigue. So this might be much more intuitive than it sounds. We've all felt that, like when we're consciously waiting for time to pass until a class is over, or until we get out on a date, we get to go out on a date, right? Or things like that, just like waiting excruciatingly. Time seems to pass more slowly, right? At least it feels like it passes more slowly. And there's even an idiom, right, devoted to this perception: a watched pot never boils. And so, if you're just standing there staring at a pot on a burner, it can seem like it's taking forever to start burning. Whereas, if you just go start watching a TV show or start having a conversation with a friend or something like that, all of a sudden the pot's boiling over and you felt like you just put it on the burner. So that's sort of the effect that we're talking about here. It's not a perfect analogy, but it's sort of the effect. The subjective changes in what the passage of time feels like. So here's what the team did. They put people in an fMRI and had them do a time comparison task. And so the task was basically looking at a gray circle. They call it a visual adapter. So it could be anything, but they picked a gray circle for a specific duration of time, and they did it 30 times in a row. And so, in other words, they were basically lying down in that giant donut thing, looking at a screen of some sort, and the screen was flashing a gray circle at a very specific interval 30 times. So the researchers were basically like training the study participant's brain, and then they were shown a test stimulus, meaning a time interval of that gray circle was either like longer or shorter than those 30 training circles that they were looking at. So the group says this produced a negative after effect. And so this is how they define that. People were exposed to a short adapter, meaning those 30 flashes of gray circles tended to happen pretty quickly. And so the people who were exposed to like rapid flashes or more rapid flashes of those gray circles, they tended to judge that following test stimulus as longer than it really was, and similarly, people who were exposed to long adapters tended to result in those people judging their test stimulus as being shorter than it really was. So in other words, if you're being exposed to some kind of stimulus, like a sound, a visual stimulus, anything like that, and it's occurring at a specific time interval, you'll tend to perceive a subsequent time-based stimulus, again, some sound or visual experience. Your perception of that subsequent experience will be biased by those initial stimuli. So that's pretty cool that they found that, but the study is cool because of the role that fMRI played. So they used it to hone in on whatever brain regions exhibited a unique response to this time interval stimulus, tweaking of the participants' brains. So in other words, they were trying to see if there's a part of the brain that's sort of acting as like a real-time metronome. For all my fellow music nerds out there, basically like a kind of stopwatch when they experience rhythmic repeated stimuli. So like right now, I'm snapping at a specific frequency, and I can't help but I can't stop talking at that interval, or at least as specific as my fallible human hands can snap at a specific frequency. By the way, the cerebellum is very important to being able to do this. So right now, you're starting to develop an expectation of when my next snap is going to occur. And in fact, if I were to keep doing it, it might just fade into being like an inconsequential stimulus. You just kind of forget I'm even doing it. So how does the brain do that? Well, the group found that a specific part of the brain, the supramarginal gyrus or SMG, that it tended to respond to this change in the duration of the stimulus that was previously being delivered at a specific and consistent frequency. And to be more specific, they hone in on the right SMG, which you can see right here. And so they suggest that this specific region may function as the substrate, or like the physical part of the brain that generates our subjective experience of time, like why it feels like it takes forever for a pot to boil if you're just sitting there watching it. So the mechanism they're saying underlies this is that after a person is exposed to stimulus, again with a specific duration, neurons in the right SMG start to get fatigued, or in other words, they just don't fire as many action potentials, or as you might call them, impulses, as measured by fMRI and neuroscience. There are many contentious debates about how this or that component of consciousness functions. Everything from addiction to memory, or to something like time perception. So some neuroscientists argue that the way we perceive time is via very early sensory receptors, so like the photoreceptors in your eyes, or like the hair cells, little cells that vibrate that enable us to hear things, or so on, right? That they are how we are able to get a sense of rhythm of a stimulus, or at least tell if a stimulus has changed its rhythm, right, all of a sudden. Like, I'm snapping like this. I'm actually bad at snapping with this hand. And then all of a sudden, it gets all, it deviates from that initial rhythm, right? So this study suggests that there's a specific part of the brain, the supramarginal gyrus, or SMG, in the right hemisphere of the brain, in which neuronal activity begins to change in a way that enables us to tell if and when there's a deviation from the initial rhythm to which we've become accustomed. So another way to put this, put what these scientists are claiming is, the way you can get a sense of how time is passing, or how the passage of time is encoded in a specific population of neurons in a specific part of the brain. And once again, that's the right SMG. So they pick up on a rhythm, these neurons, at which something around you is happening. Someone tapping on the table, or a clock ticking, or perhaps someone dancing. Maybe if they're dancing in a very rhythmic fashion. As you're watching, and whatever it is you're watching is following that rhythm, effectively, the neurons in that specific part of the brain just sort of start to calm down. But then, once that thing that you're watching or listening to deviates from its original rhythm, you'll tend to over or underestimate whatever the new rhythm is, right? You become biased. You'll either anticipate that the rhythm is quicker or slower than it really is. So another thing, that's cool. It would be an exaggeration to suggest that this has mapped out the entirety of how we perceive time, but it's a really important component of how we perceive this facet of time, deviations from set rhythms. So cool study, and like it's nice that they use a very simple kind of experimental design, stimulus, rather than like having all of these different contingencies, because it kind of narrows in on a simple component of the brain that encodes this capability. Okay, so another thing that I thought might be worth mentioning, just given the state of the world right now, was a study that was put out by a collaboration between Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, a school I was considering going to, and in the National Institute on Drug Abuse, or NIDA, which is in Maryland, Bethesda, Maryland. And so the study was focused on whether there might be any relationships between the susceptibility to coming down with COVID-19 and substance use disorders, informally often called addiction. This group basically scrutinized the health records of millions of patients in the U.S. And to be clear, these are anonymous data, so they don't know if any one given person corresponds to a patient in their data, right? Totally anonymous. But what they found was that people with a substance use disorder represented 10.3% of the total population in their study. So in other words, a bit over 10% of the people in their sample of patients diagnosed with COVID-19 had a substance use disorder. But it turned out that those same people comprised 15.6% of cases of COVID-19 within that giant group of patients that they assessed. So specifically, it turned out that people who had a diagnosis of a substance use disorder on their medical record tended to be more likely to develop COVID-19, and it turned out specifically people who had an opioid use disorder, and then were represented the greatest proportion, followed by tobacco-related substance use disorder, smoking, stuff like that, were more frequently associated with COVID-19 than those without a substance use disorder. So Dr. Nora Volkow, so she's the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, said, quote, the lungs and cardiovascular system are often compromised in people with SUD, meaning substance use disorder, which may partially explain their heightened susceptibility to COVID-19. Another contributing factor is the marginalization of people with addiction, which makes it harder for them to access healthcare services. It is incumbent upon clinicians to meet the unique challenges of caring for this vulnerable population just as they would any other high-risk group. And so, frankly, I think the last point she makes, at least in my humble opinion, is perhaps more explanatory. We know, what we know is that there's a correlation between substance use disorder and COVID-19. Okay, so The study focused on individuals who, again, obviously have substance use disorder associated with alcohol, cannabis, cocaine, and opioids. So over 73 million patients comprised of this study, and over 7.5 million of them had been diagnosed with a substance use disorder at some point. 12,030 of those patients came down with COVID-19, and then 1,880 of those COVID-19 patients were also associated with a diagnosis of a substance use disorder. And, before getting into some of the more specific correlations I identified, I think it's worth, emphasizing right now that correlations are exactly what they identified, right? Correlations, not any kind of biological mechanism. So, and the cause of these correlations is open to debate. What they said, so they found that individuals with a lifetime substance use disorder, meaning like they had a substance use disorder at some point in their lives, had a higher risk of developing COVID-19, right? An opioid use disorder seemed to have the highest risk of coming down with COVID-19, followed by those who had cocaine use disorder, then alcohol use disorder, and then tobacco use disorder. Or in other words, people who use tobacco products in one form or another, smoking, chew, pipes, cigars, and then cannabis use disorder was associated with the lowest correlation. And it's worth noting that individuals with substance use disorder frequently have other biomedical concerns beyond just the substance use disorder, including cardiovascular, pulmonary, and metabolic diseases. And when it comes to intravenous drug use in particular, exposure to bloodborne pathogens becomes a significantly higher risk, hepatitis or HIV. And so importantly, the group highlights that a recent diagnosis of SUD tended to also have a higher prevalence of asthma, chronic kidney disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, diabetes, cancer, HIV, chronic liver disease, cardiovascular diseases like hypertension and obesity, relative to patients who did not ever have a substance use disorder diagnosis. And it also turned out that a recent diagnosis of an SUD was more closely correlated with a COVID-19 diagnosis, right? So the more recently this substance use disorder was diagnosed, the higher the risk of COVID-19. And, just want to emphasize that, once again, this is a correlational finding. So this is not necessarily causative. It may just be that people who have been in a position to be diagnosed with a substance use disorder more recently are more likely to also be evaluated for these other maladies, as well as pursue a test for COVID-19 because they've recently engaged the biomedical system or the medical system specifically. And so they might just be more readily interested in engaging. They start coughing, they start having a fever, they might be just more likely to more rapidly go get tested for COVID-19 rather than kind of wait it out and perhaps spontaneously recover. And so I could speculate in so many directions with these data, but let's just play with two possible interpretations of what's going on. The first is that it may be the case that individuals who have a substance use disorder are statistically more likely to seek out novelty, right? Risk-seeking behavior, novelty-seeking. And so maybe, they might just be more disturbed by the monotony of sheltering at home and therefore be more likely to jump at the opportunity to participate in some kind of social gathering, perhaps to consume substances or not, just to sort of satisfy that draw of novelty. And then so that's potential interpretation one. Another, second, is that the process of obtaining these substances requires in-person interactions, right? So people are interacting with other people to obtain substances, not necessarily always, but it's just one more point of possible interaction that individuals who don't consume these substances just wouldn't experience, right? They don't worry about having to go to their local drug dealer to get their heroin, or if people don't drink, they're not going to go to a bar, they're not going to meet up in a social gathering where everybody's drinking. You sort of get the idea, right? That for people who don't consume these substances, that's just never a variable in potential exposure. So, okay, one more interpretation. I know that several labs, like my former lab, has been exploring a possible relationship between the consumption of psychoactive substances and an inflammatory response in general, meaning like there's an immune system response that occurs when you consume a bunch of substances, not only one specific one, but a bunch of substances can be treated by the immune system as a pathogen, or the immune system can respond as though it's mounting this inflammatory response. That's one of the theories for why people have hangovers after drinking alcohol, a lot of alcohol too quickly, is that there's this general inflammatory response that gives you a headache. And so, perhaps there's some component of the immune system reaction. People are consuming substances, their immune system is a little bit elevated, and so maybe that exacerbates a person's response once exposed to COVID-19. They have this immune system response that's in hyper overdrive, right? If you were paying attention, particularly in the beginning of the pandemic in the United States, there was a lot of discussion like a cytokine storm and wreaking havoc. Like I've described it before, it's like the immune system just carpet bombing whole organ systems because it's just so revved up by SARS-CoV-2. But anyway, so it turned out that patients with substance use disorder of some kind who came down with COVID-19 also had significantly worse outcomes relative to the general group of patients, right? The big giant group. And the study also explores a bunch more statistical analyses that, at least in my humble opinion, are kind of speculative, in the absence of a mechanism, whether there's any evidence that the specific pharmacological effects of various drugs have any kind of specific effect on how SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, interacts with the body. But honestly, I think that these aren't the data that could justify that kind of speculation. It's purely statistical correlation. It's good to think about these things, but I just, again, in my humble opinion, I would prefer to have a mechanistic discussion as a component of that, rather than just say more people with who are addicted to opioids tended to come down with SARS-CoV-2 or have some kind of fatal reaction, and so there must be some kind of specific biological mechanism that has nothing to do with the environment, some interaction between the opioid, heroin or fentanyl or oxycodone, and the virus. That could be the case, or the way the body responds to the opioids, may render people more vulnerable to, a severe COVID-19 diagnosis. It could totally be the case, but first of all, I don't really think that that's the case. That would be unique to any one drug, but could be the case. But these data don't really elucidate that. So anyways, all of this to say, this thing is not over in the United States. It's still an ongoing tragedy. Just this last week on Friday, I think, I heard a story from a mother who's working on her master's degree, and she's had to take her very, very young child to the pediatrician because the child was experiencing some troubling symptoms that seemed reminiscent of COVID-19, and the pediatrician sent them home. The child was doing okay, right? It wasn't super severe yet. The next day, they ended up in the emergency room because the child's symptoms were getting significantly worse. And the child, said, and this is the part that just destroyed me as the father of a baby girl, that's a bit over a year and a half old. The child said it hurts to breathe. Oof, I couldn't imagine what I would do, if I heard that from my child. And so this experience of this family happened on this past Wednesday. And, they're still waiting on a test to see if the child has COVID-19. And so, we're still dealing with this thing in this country. And, it's just worth keeping in mind that some folks are, for whatever reason, are facing more severe consequences of being exposed to this virus, than others. So, if you have any empathy for those folks, or particularly if you have any of them in your family, keep wearing your masks. All right. I'm off my soapbox. There's a bunch of other really cool studies that I really wanted to talk about. I just hadn't talked about something like time perception in a long time. There was a study that came out about dissociation, which is basically the feeling of being disconnected from your body and reality. Something like 2 to 10% of the population experience dissociation during their lifetimes, at some point, according to Carl Dieserath, a very successful scientist. And the way it's kind of hard, at least for me, and even for patients or people that I know who have been diagnosed with dissociation, it's kind of hard to describe. So this is his description. I think it's kind of interesting. This state often manifests as the perception of being on the outside, looking in at the cockpit of a plane that's your body and mind, and what you're seeing you just don't consider to be yourself. And so Dieserath treated a patient with chronic seizures at Stanford, and the patient started feeling dissociation immediately before every seizure, which is pretty wild. It's sort of like an aura is what we refer to those kind of side effects of a seizure. And so nearly 3/4 of everybody who's had a traumatic experience in their lives will experience dissociation at some point. Which is it's a lot higher than I thought. 3/4, the majority of people with a traumatic experience will experience dissociation at some point. That's a pretty high proportion, and it usually subsides on its own. but it can become chronic. Conditions like PTSD can be associated with repeated dissociation. And so, yeah, what was cool about the study is that they stimulated the patient's cerebral cortex, the posteromedial cortex, that seemed to correspond to these seizures. And not only that, it turned out that when they'd have a very similar, that the patient would have a very similar kind of experience of dissociation when the scientists would stimulate that specific part of the brain experimentally. So, an interesting study, and maybe I will just dive into that one a little bit more, next week. But then there's also a study that characterized migraine. And so this was a study from Tokyo Medical and Dental University. And basically they showed that migraines, it's been known now for a while that cortical spreading depression, or CSD, that's basically like large waves of self-propagating activation of neurons that spreads across the brain, followed by a wave of inhibition of neuronal activity. So sort of like, the waves of the ocean or something, right? Peaks and valleys that propagate. And so what CSD is associated with a lot of different things. It's not just migraines. So like it can cause scintillating scotomas, which one of my favorite terms for anything in neuroscience, scintillating. and I don't think I've ever experienced this, but it's not like, it can be totally benign, but it's basically like a flickering blur in your visual field that can be like right in the middle of your visual field. It's just, there's nothing scintillating in your environment. Your eyes are just sort of fabricating this experience. And scintillating scotomas are frequently treated with migraine drugs, topiramate or valproate or propranolol, amitriptyline, methotrexate. I don't know. I never really know how to pronounce that drug, but so Tanaka, Koichi Tanaka, who's the principal investigator over at Tokyo Medical and Dental University, he said that, I assume I'm not sure, but he said, we know that 90% of glutamate is transported by GLT1, which, by the way, is a glial glutamate transporter, which transports glutamate back into astrocytes, not neurons. So, and then he says, our findings thus highlight another important function of glial cells in the brain as they support neuronal function. And basically, like a glial glutamate transporter, what that is like, it's a protein that shuffles glutamate out of the extracellular space, the space that's like outside of cells. And so they worked with, a bunch of mice that, who had this gene altered. And it turned out that only mice lacking the gene for this glial glutamate transporter exhibited brain activity that looked like cortical spreading depression. Again, that pattern of waves of excitation and inhibition that's been correlated with at least some migraines. And so Tanaka also says a normal glutamate reuptake by astrocytes is just one way to overexcite neurons. Nevertheless, if GLT1 proves to be disrupted in people who have migraines, drug therapy that acts to increase glial reuptake of glutamate may be a reasonable therapeutic approach. Pretty cool. Always nice to have, a lot of people suffer from migraines, so it's always nice to have another alternative. And then just one last one that I think is cool if you're interested in psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin. This brilliant lab, the lab of a guy who invented the technology that I used for my PhD, basically got really specific on how it is that LSD binds the sort of the central receptor in the pharmacological activity of psychedelics, the 5-HT2A receptor, and basically mapped out like pretty much precisely where something like LSD. They also studied another more selective for 5-HT2A psychedelic, and it's really interesting. All of these psychedelics can have pretty different effects, subjective effects. They all share a lot of effects. Obviously, they're all part of the same family of drugs, but psychedelics really have not been, meticulously or rigorously studied at a level that I think is commensurate with their potential utility or what they could teach us, and their potential clinical utility, And so, great scientists doing great science. This is like, hardcore medicinal chemistry, structure-activity relationships. It's like, if you are interested in neuroscience, but you're not necessarily like super interested in the kind of fluffier stuff like consciousness or psychology, medicinal chemistry is a critical field that plays a very important role in this stage of neuroscience at which we're currently living. Okay, so hey, and sorry I'm late. Hey Scott, what's up, man? I have a question, but don't want to hog your time. Super Mario gyrus. Yes, yeah, the Mario gyrus, supramarginal gyrus. Cleveland represent. Yeah, Cleveland. There is so Case Western is in Cleveland, but then there's another one, isn't there? Or no, is that the Cleveland Clinic, I suppose? But meanwhile, professional athletes and their trainers are getting treated daily. Yeah. I'm working on a study in infants to study milk fat globule membranes and their effects on brain myelin. In a nutshell, very, very cool. I assume you're referring to breast milk. Although, I suppose if it's just milk fat globule membrane, I mean, I imagine that formula that would be relevant to formula too. That's awesome. I mean, there's I could go on and on about again, I had a baby and my wife gave birth, right? As these things normally go, and man, the amount of pressure that mothers are under to breastfeed is pretty intense. Fortunately, it worked out really nicely for the girls, but man, the guilt that a lot of mothers feel if they can't, it's really hard. It's much harder than I think people think. Before I took all these baby classes, I always assumed it was just it's sort of what is it, a gazelle is born knowing how to walk, a baby human is born knowing very little, but that's one of them. But no, I mean, they really have to work at it, and some of the experts really kind of or some of lactation consultants, like any other field, there's differences in their approaches, and some are just so probably old school. They're just very intense, and so anyways, both. Yeah, good stuff. Awesome. Good luck with your study. All right, why don't we start the live half? Hello, everybody. My name is Ian McLaughlin, and I have a PhD in neuroscience. And I studied the neurobiology, trying to map out part of the neurobiology of addiction and anxiety, focusing in on what I think is the most important circuit in the brain, and I'm not biased at all. And so on YouTube, I just talked about a study. Actually, I talked about a bunch of studies. I didn't really intend to do that, but a bunch of studies that, one of which, the main one that I discussed, was how it is that our brain perceives the passage of time. And it's just one component of time perception. This is a question that neuroscientists have been asking for, decades. I mean, arguably scientists and natural philosophers for centuries. And it has to do with rhythm detector essentially, and it's pretty cool. It's a cool study, and I think it's also kind of easy to understand what they did. If anything, I probably made it harder to understand because of my description of it, but you can go check it out. My YouTube channel is youtube.com/anthropoid, and of course I forgot. I also talked about a study that was done to see if there's any relationship between addiction or substance use disorder and COVID-19 and the severity of COVID-19. There's this evaluation of a gigantic patient population, millions, and so we can check that out. I talked about the study that modeled the serotonin 5-HT2A receptor, that is the prime receptor to which all psychedelics essentially bind. Cool study done by a really great lab that you can check out as well. And then what was the other thing? Oh, I talked about a new discovery of a potential cause of migraines, and therefore a potential target for new medications for migraines. And a mechanism that underlies this cause of migraines. And I think there was one more, wasn't there? Anyways, you answered my question back in March, and I want to thank you again for that. Love from Morocco. Oh yeah, I totally remember that. Awesome. My pleasure, honestly. Do you think that humans will ever start to use more of their brains than we do now? So, sugar tax, Max. So, if you'll permit me to infer a little bit, would I be wrong to presume that you believe that humans don't use all of the brain real estate that's available to them, that we're somehow limited to a certain percentage? Because if you believe that, that's actually not the case. There are a bunch of myths, particularly the zombie myth, that humans only use 10% of our brains, and that's just not true. You're not limited to any percentage of the brain, by a law of nature or biology or whatever. you're just limited. Basically, you're limited by a couple things, but like the main one is that you're limited by a level where if you have any more brain activity, you're technically starting to have a seizure. But then the other thing is that the amount of brain activity that's occurring at any one time when you're trying to complete a task, like take a test, or drive, or play the guitar, or trying to do a specific thing, the amount of brain activity it's correlated more directly to how much you practice doing that thing. And in fact, generally speaking, as you develop expertise, the amount of brain activity that's occurring at any one time narrows down and actually is reduced. And I could go on. I talk about this all the time, but it's sort of like, if you can imagine, we're having this conversation right now. Let's say we're having it in a bar and we're wearing a mask and everything, but imagine we're having this conversation in a bar and it's just you and me at a table talking. So that would be like what the brain looks like when you develop expertise. Only the specific important components of a given task of brain activity that enables you to complete a task is active. And now imagine if the Eagles, there's a football game and the Eagles are playing and the bar is filled with a bunch of rowdy Philly Eagles fans, and they're all yelling and screaming and knocking us in our heads and like all that kind of stuff. That would be much harder for us to have this conversation, because there's just all this ancillary activity that's totally unimportant to our conversation, that's getting in the way, that's making it harder for us to hear each other. That would be sort of like if you were to just crank up your brain activity when you're trying to learn how to play the piano. But so, I just wanted to engage that potential myth. But I do think that there is something to be said for the fact that, patterns of brain activity, if this would be a crazy study to try and do, and you couldn't ever do it, but, if you could imagine, we could come up with there's like some satellite fMRI that can evaluate everybody's patterns of brain activity. And you sort of averaged it, like, what is the typical human brain activity right now? I'm sure it has actually changed quite considerably since, we were evolving in the savannas of Africa. But the brain itself has not changed. At least as far as we're aware, this is about a, 100,000, multiple hundreds of thousands year old organ. And, maybe there's been some subtle anatomical changes over time. So, give me tens of thousands of years old organ. But human experience has changed so much that we probably tend to utilize parts of our brain more frequently than we would otherwise. Were we not inventing technologies and trying to cure diseases and stuff. That's possible. And so I think like a way to sort of like tweak that topic is will humans will the patterns of brain activity in humans change such that we are, objectively somehow more intelligent? There's something called the Flynn effect, where basically, IQs, like in aggregate, like the, average IQs of humans increases over time. And it's not quite understood why that is. There's a very contentious debate about how that happens. But so, there is evidence that humans are getting more intelligent, at least by that specific measure, insofar as the IQ test measures some component of intelligence. So yes, ultimately, I think to the question you're really asking, yes. Okay, we have a caller. So I think your name is Irene, and if so, where are you calling from?
Hi. So before I start, I just want you to know, like, I'm not trolling or anything, but I was wondering, like, what is it like with like dark humor? Like, is that like something that, like, I don't know, why do I have fucked up humor?
Why do you have dark humor?
Yeah, is there like something in the brain that like gives you dark humor?
Very, very literally, yes, right? There will be some difference between patterns of brain activity for somebody who's, telling a joke that's totally benign and not. But I would be more interested if we were trying to understand the cause in, your life experiences, how you were raised, the comedians that you were exposed to, that kind of thing.
For example, like the other day, I saw a video of like a cow getting hit by a train, and I laughed for like 10 minutes straight. And then like I saw a video of people getting murdered.
Yeah, no, that sounds I imagine you are not trolling, but it's sort of just uncomfortable with that. That's not humor. Okay. And sincerely, like if you're really it might be worth consulting with a psychiatrist, psychologist. That's not really my expertise. All right. So we have connected with our good friend Abyss. What's on your mind, man?
Hey, Ian. How's it going?
Nah, okay, hanging in there. How about you?
Yeah, pretty much, I would say. Yeah. So I was gonna probably make this some kind of like a journal club kind of thing because I did catch up on some of your discussion on YouTube about some of the papers. So I'm just gonna like probably spend like 10 minutes before some serious questions come, like some other viewers are asking like more serious questions. So I had some idea, like, so when you talked about the supramarginal gyrus, I was actually under the impression that, timekeepers would be those brain areas which we know fire constantly, like the inferior olive or, any kind of, calcium channels and then like the basal parts of the brain. But I was really surprised that it was actually a cortical area that ended up, regulating time. I don't know. Were you surprised about that?
Yeah, I mean, yes. Generally speaking, like, when you're in an intro neuro class, like, rhythm detection or rhythm execution tends to focus on the cerebellum or, Purkinje neurons that can fire together very easily, very rapidly. And, frankly, I have not really engaged very much cortical research at all, like in my own experience, let alone, the SMG. But yeah, I mean, I totally expected that this was going to be a cerebellum paper. So yeah, but, a lot of neurons in the cortex. So there's a lot of opportunities for, variation and stuff like that. Yeah.
I know. And I was also like really surprised that they didn't administer the test or like the experiment under the influence of extrinsic like near factors like suppose like if there's an excess amount of dopamine, for example, it's going to alter our perception. So I was really hoping that they would test their subjects under the influence of like L-DOPA, so that they can actually see if there's some tampering, like if there's like a difference in perception of time. So I was really hoping that they would actually show that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the most interesting effects of psychedelics in my mind is that they can very powerfully alter time perception, where people will have been sitting in one spot for like 2 minutes and they feel like they've been sitting there for like 5 days, or the opposite, where it's like 3 hours have passed and it feels like that, right? So I mean, that I would be very interested specifically in serotonergic modulation of time perception, just because I don't really know. I mean, but not that dopaminergic modulation isn't also important. Like we know, subjectively, like a drug like methamphetamine or whatever, any kind of dopaminergic psychostimulant can also influence time, right, or time perception. Where like somebody on methamphetamine will like disassemble their computer, and spend like 7 hours doing that, and like that motivation component of time the passage of time, I think is also an interesting component. I mean, it's clearly like a very distributed system, but I don't really know of many other families of drugs that like are known to like pretty consistently totally warp time perception. Yeah, I mean, but totally, that would be a really cool study, and a study that could be done. I mean, it's not like that's a really, really complicated intervention. Obviously, working with psychedelics is difficult, but they could do that. What I thought you were suggesting is that they like administered some kind of drug that puts everybody on the same page dopaminergically, right? So you're like controlling for inter-individual differences. That would be really, really cool. This is, I imagine that this lab is gonna keep picking up all the tree that are hanging from this fruit. So maybe we'll see it.
Right, because some of the earlier treatments for Parkinson's administering L-Dopa, right? To increase their dopamine level, because they were getting it from sources like the different nucleus that provide dopamine. So they did see that some of them actually engage in like extreme addiction, like gambling or something like that. So there's definitely going to be some kind of behavioral change. But in addition to that, what they witnessed was that there is also an alteration of time perception. So that's why I asked you about the dopamine. But methamphetamines also can also have some influence. But I
That's
think it
interesting.
would have been nicer if they could have like uniform dopamine level, like you mentioned.
Yeah, that would be really cool. That'd be really hard, but to know if they have like a standardized pseudo standardized levels of dopamine. I didn't know that about Parkinson's treatments altering time perception. I mean, I suppose it makes sense, but yeah, that's really interesting. Cool.
Yeah, I mean, I'm gonna have to go back and look up the paper and probably send it to you. But
Yeah.
I heard about this like a long time ago, so I'm gonna have to do more digging. So the other thing that really tripped me up was you said that they used the blinking type of metronome in the experiment, like
Yeah, it was it was a visual stimulus, and I think I probably kind of I think I wasn't specific enough in the way I described the paper. Like I said, it could be any sensory modality. It could be an auditory one, and that I actually probably should not have said that because it was specifically a visual stimulus, and it may very well be the case that some adjacent nucleus or a totally different one would be the one that enables you to detect a sort of rhythmicity of an auditory stimulus or a tactile experience, but I think it's safe to say that if this structure is doing it for visual activity, some other structure will be doing it similarly, right? And perhaps it is the SMG, the right SMG, yeah.
right. So I was wondering, because we know that SMG actually responds to gestures and other kinds of motion-related objects. So I was wondering if the metronome was actually provided by a human type gesture, like flicking your hand and fingers, or is this just like a simple dot blinking on the screen? I was wondering if there's going to be a perception change because that this SMG actually responds more to the human gesture, but I could be wrong though. This is just on my cursory look. It would have been something worth investigating.
That is a really good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
What's happening? Hold on. Sorry about that. Yeah, I mean, I bet you're right about that. That there's a difference between detecting rhythm in inanimate objects versus anthropoids, human-like activity. Yeah, I mean, I bet you're right about that.
Right. And that paper that you presented on subcortical spreading depression was pretty interesting. I know some people that are actually working on that, but they were doing it using EEG and FNIRS.
Yeah, right.
And they're trying to do the signal correlation. But I was really curious to find out that there are glial-glutamate transporters that actually reuptake glutamate into the glial cells.
Yeah, and I think the lead investigator said that 90% of extracellular glutamate is reuptaken by astrocytes specifically. That's wild. I mean, that's the vast majority of it. I didn't realize that. I mean, it doesn't sound completely ridiculous to me or anything, but I didn't realize that it was that dominant of a role. Yeah, it's a cool study. Not only that they associated the cortical, cortical spreading depression, I think, right? With migraine, but also they honed in on that specific transporter. But it is also worth mentioning that they're judging this by mouse behavior, and so it may not translate perfectly, but it could could make sense. But anyways, listen, man, thanks so much for calling in. It's awesome to talk to you, and hopefully I'll talk to you again soon.
Sure.
All right, take it easy. All right, man. This always takes it to like the next level. It's pretty awesome. Oh, is somebody calling in? Oh, multiple people are calling in. Sorry about that, everybody. Let's see. I think Andromeda called in first. I think. So Andromeda, what's your name and where are you calling from?
Hey brother, what's up, man? My name's Duke, calling from LA. Glad it's kind of refreshing to see someone on here that's not twerking and shaking their ass in front of the camera, you know. And
Oh well, I just haven't gotten to that part of the show yet.
Oh shit, okay. I have a question. I was curious about your take on a lot of, you know who John Hagelin is?
John Hagel?
Hagelin. He
Hagel.
does a lot of lectures on the unified field theory, and kind of one of the forerunners, I think, on bridging the gap between the science community and the spirituality community. So I was wondering your take on the observer effect relative to the nature of consciousness. How measuring something like an electron from a human subjective standpoint can really kind of explain what consciousness is and why consciousness is, and why it has an effect on the universe in such a way relative to these studies that we've done measuring these little particles as either a particle or a wave if unobserved.
Wow. Okay. Let's see. So I really honestly have not given much thought to the role that the observer effect would play in consciousness. Yeah, man. Like I would have to think about that for a while because it's just not. It's just not something I've thought about very much.
I do something called lucid dreaming, and I love. There's a psychologist that I really love named Stephen LaBarge, and he's done most of his studies and his lectures that he's done have revolved around the mechanism of lucid dreaming and actually proving that it's a real thing. And since I've started lucid dreaming back in 2007, in my own opinion, I've kind of doubled my life memories. So I'm storing a lot more information in the brain because I am not only storing information from my daily waking life, but also having to take advantage of possible, neural connections that I might not have taken advantage of before, storing these new memories and adding to my life experiences. And for me, in my own theory, what's going on here in the physical world is very relative to what's going on in the lucid dreaming world. Because in that world, becoming self-aware in that world and looking out at things like mountains and trees, and you become cognizant of the fact that what you're looking at is an extension of you. It is you taking from yourself to create a scenario where you are one thing relative to another. So basically duality. Then I come back to this physical waking world, and I kind of am suspicious of the same thing going on here. And what we're discovering in the physics world, in the quantum physics world, is that these electrons tend to know that they're being watched, and what you look at kind of creates your reality. And what you're not looking at is the whole does a tree, if a tree falls in the middle of the woods, does it make a sound or does it even exist? And that this experiment says that it exists and it doesn't exist. It makes a sound and it doesn't make a sound. Until somebody is there to observe it, what you observe is exactly what's happening. Any thoughts on that at all?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so lucid dreaming specifically, yeah. So that's interesting. So let me ask you: do you do any kind of training regimen, any kind of meditation or specific sleep schedule to amplify the likelihood of having a lucid dream?
Most definitely. I practice meditation called Vipassana.
Oh, sure.
I've been practicing it for years. It's focusing on the breath meditation, and you go deeper and deeper, and kind of in my experience at least, everything that I am disappears. The only thing that kind of reappears or any sense of being is when I think of it, and immediately if I think of my body, my body will reappear. If you forget about the fact that you're with a body, it tends to disappear. It's kind of a strange phenomenon. But I also journal. I'm on my 6th journal. I'm working on a book right now, my first book on this study. And I'm an independent researcher, but I carry a little something in my pocket. If you've ever seen the movie Inception, they kind of do that. And every time I touch it, it kind of reminds me to do a reality check, look around, really consider that I might be dreaming, and it's I don't know, man. I think it's woken me up in a way that I've completely fallen in love with life. The back and forth from the waking body to the dream body, the adventures of leaving the planet, doing things like time traveling, becoming self-aware in that world, thinking about my body in bed, sleeping, while I still feel like I'm looking out of a face, while I still feel like my consciousness is put together as a certain thing, has completely blown my mind and changed everything I knew about the nature of consciousness and its expression as life.
Well, geez, man, that's wonderful. Couldn't imagine a better endorsement of at least some kind of mindfulness meditation, if not Vipassana. Yeah, so I mean, there have been, several studies that, scrutinize the patterns of brain activity that are unique to a lucid dream, using like neuroimaging. And yeah, I mean, I think at this point it's fairly uncontroversial. Like, I think pretty much everybody within neuroscience agrees that it's a real thing. It's a distinct thing from like normal dreaming. There have been studies that hone in on, generally speaking, as we fall asleep, different parts of the brain become active as we're falling asleep, and parts of the brain that tend to be more active when we're awake tend to be inhibited. There's sort of like this handoff effect. And one of there's a bunch of like specific structures that tend to be inhibited when we're sleeping that seem to be more active when somebody's having a lucid dream. So specifically forebrain structures, like a bunch of different brain structures are inhibited as we fall asleep, but in particular the forebrain structures are, and we could get into what the forebrain is generally associated with in terms of like components of consciousness, but broadly speaking, it's sort of like probably the most human part of our brain, meaning like it enables us to contemplate the potential contingencies of different activities. It enables us to inhibit urges as a result. It enables us to decide to do the harder thing just because we know it'll pay off in the future. In other words, delay gratification. And so that, I mean, that definitely, at this point, I mean, I think that that's among the most consistently, associated with lucid dreaming. And so, okay, another thing was that, so I'm totally not surprised. Like, the reason I'm like specifically talking about lucid dreaming, I did a podcast episode on lucid dreaming. You can learn a lot about the brain by studying basically dream research, or by, looking at dream research, but then, particularly lucid dreaming. But anyways, there are a bunch of different strategies that people employed to try and increase the likelihood that they would lucid dream. And some of them are far more effective than others. But one of them, was meditation. And like in some cases, it was like, focusing on specifically wanting to have a lucid dream. But another was, like coming up with a kind of schedule. Like a kind of you go to sleep, normal sleep night, and then you wake up, you meditate for like 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and then you go right back to sleep. Generally speaking, that's when you can have at least a more vivid dream, but also
I bet that it's 2 hours. Usually if you're going for an 8-hour sleep cycle, you wake up an hour and a half or 2 hours before your 8-hour mark, actually get up, walk around your room, stay up for 15 minutes, and then go back to sleep, and you'll go right into REM sleep. That's exactly what I'm talking about. And so, I mean, there's a bunch of others. Journaling is easily one of the most, widely used of people who are pursuing lucid dreams. But it's not as effective as some of these other measures. I mean, some of them like are pretty wild. Like, they will, and this was done experimentally, but like somebody falls asleep, but they're wearing a kind of like a vibrator type of thing on their finger. And then as scientists are observing changes in brain activity, once they detect that the person is in REM sleep, they'll start vibrating that thing. And so it's sort of like a signal, very subtle signal, not enough to wake them up, but a sort of sensory signal that, oh wait, that's right, I'm dreaming. They do that with the mask as well. They'll
right.
Stephen Labarge LaBarge, he did studies over in Stanford, and he put a mask on somebody, and once they detected, the brain waves were in REM sleep state, they would flash a light in the eye.
Yep.
And that lucid dreamer, before they fell asleep, they instructed him to, once you become self-realized in this world and you understand that this flashing is coming from the outside world, we want you to look left, look right, look left, look right, and it worked. I mean, I would say like 7 out of 10 people that they tested this on, it actually worked, and they would, send back signals via the body to the researcher that they were actually getting the signal and responding to it by looking left, looking right, looking left, looking right. I love it, dude. I did 10 days in a retreat, a Vipassana meditation retreat. So it was 10 days of silence, and I found that the more you deprive yourself of daily waking stimuli, the brain will kind of overcompensate for that and give you even more vivid dreams. When I was there, it was literally 4:30 a.m. till 9:30 lights out. We would meditate all day with the exception of like taking a shower and an hour to eat breakfast and lunch. And my God, bro, it was the most vivid, most quote unquote realistic dreams that I've ever had in my life. Like I was there, just as there as I am here. And what I love about lucid dreaming now that I've been doing it for so long, that I've completely redefined what reality is to me. Like, it's just as real while I'm there. I mean, even my mind, when I'm not having a flying dream, subconsciously, unbeknownst to my own, conscious cognitive awareness, creates gravity for you. You're not even trying to say, okay, I'm going to paint these mountains. I'm going to make sure I have to keep gravity going, or else I'm going to float off. No, it just does it for you in a world where you can completely cancel out the rules of physics and laws of physics, and you can start flying if you want. But most people are used to the effects of gravity, so they subconsciously create it for themselves in that world, unbeknownst to them as a conscious awareness. It's mind-boggling, and I wish there was a lot of studies in this, because I really think with a lot of what John Hagelin says in his lectures, about the unified field and what's going on with the observer effect relative to consciousness, I really think it can explain a lot as to what's going on in this physical waking world as, a possible theory that this waking world is just another expression of our, intrinsic consciousness. And I don't know how really we could measure the brain on that level, and how to explain it with the brain, but do you think that brain function is 100% a product of consciousness, or do you think consciousness is 100% a product of brain?
Yeah. I gotcha. Yeah, that's funny. Last week this came up as well. Somebody called in, more interested in sort of like the differences between like compatibilism and hard determinism and stuff like that. So the short story is yes, I am pretty materialist and pretty determinist, at least my perspective, and I think it's safe to say at this point most neuroscientists are, where the sort of the model of dualism, where, just so everybody's on the same page, basically the argument is that consciousness is somehow separable from the physical stuff of our body and our brain, and there are some like nuances there, like it can be something called compatibilism, where the brain is very, very important to generating consciousness, but there is something else too. And then there are people like me who, yes, I mean, I think that we've come far enough in neuroscience to have enough, just so many lines of evidence that the consciousness is something that the brain generates, it produces. And, that obviously there are unique features of human consciousness, but there are other examples of consciousness as well. And the differences in different animals' consciousness is explainable, it's explicable by differences in anatomy, right? And so yeah, and I mean, I could go on, but yeah, I'm in that camp. Also just from my own experiments, like I don't want to get too into the details, but like, by just tweaking just a couple of neurons, I mean, a couple hundred neurons, you could cause an animal to turn in circles for hours, or you could cause an animal to, just fly, like run around super, super fast. And it really is like a one-to-one relationship. It's very, very complicated. Like, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that it's easy to reduce consciousness to its constituent parts, but I just think that there's enough evidence that, and, you know, we can explain most questions that come up. We can't answer all questions, but, you know, given enough time and given the right technology and you know, human brain power, you know, you can explain components of consciousness without having to have this sort of X factor, you know, of, well, then, you know, this must be a byproduct of some external substrate for consciousness. So yeah, you know, this isn't really a settled question in neuroscience. There are absolutely, particularly neurophilosophers, who would be more amenable to a compatibilist framework or even a dualist framework. But generally speaking, I think most neuroscientists you'd encounter would probably say what I just said.
You said you feel like there is that little bit something else that maybe is not related to brain function when it comes to consciousness. Do you have any theories as to, in your own life personally, that you know, you might have to share that you think is that little something else that explains what consciousness is?
So
whether on a spiritual or on a you know, other kind of scientific theory.
So I was just describing what some, you know, positions are. I personally think that it's all in the brain, that the physical, you know, structures of the brain are what generate consciousness. And if you alter any one part of the brain, you're going to alter some component of consciousness. Inextricably, like inevitably. Like, you won't be able to avoid doing that. It might be subtle, but it'll still happen. But, like, you know, here's one potential you know, hypothesis for somebody who is pursuing a more dualist explanation for consciousness, that there is something about that consciousness is far greater than the sum of its parts, and its parts are important, and without those parts you won't have consciousness. But it could be the case that, like, and this is not my own perspective, but, you know, one could argue that it is the combination of just the right ingredients, just the right anatomical ingredients, that need to happen for there to be consciousness. So, you know, were it not for, you know, pretty much all animal brains share a lot of features. I mean, obviously there's some meaningful and important differences, but, you know, everybody has some kind of all animals have some kind of motor system if they move, you know, some kind of sensory modality that enables them to detect changes in their environment, right? You know, it's like, if you're going to make chicken soup, you have to add chicken, right? You know, so it could be the case that, like, that in and of itself, like the importance of the combination of all these structures is a non-physical thing. It's you know, almost, it's like it's not, you know, it's not deterministic necessarily, but, you know, frankly, I just think that, like, that is splitting hairs in a way that, like, I just don't think that it's a meaningful. I don't think it is a powerful way to explain consciousness given what we know already about the brain. And so and then, you know, in terms of, like, you know, how neuroscience you know, encounters spiritual questions fairly regularly, maybe the most of any scientific discipline other than maybe physics. You know, I'm no expert in spirituality. You know, I spent my life learning about the brain and you know, doing experiments to learn more about the brain. So, you know, far be it from me to try and, you know, just opine about more spiritual questions. You know, you'd be better served talking to somebody who is experienced in those questions.
So relative to neuroscience, how would you define, in your own opinion, what enlightenment is? What enlightenment is? Do you think it's a level, strictly a level of maybe like someone's intellect, or do you think it has more to do? I mean, this might even be a mix of, like, kind of a psychology sort of thing, you know, but what is enlightenment to you? How would you explain that? Super
interesting question, and topic. And, you know, obviously we don't have the specific answer for that question, but I mean, it's a tough one because, you know, I bet if you were to ask, you know, 5 people who are interested in this and are interested in meditation and maybe even studied, you know, Buddhism or just enlightenment in general across traditions, you'd probably get like 6 answers for what enlightenment is. Like, You know,
it could be a subjective matter of opinion as well. You know, some people
exactly.
can describe it one way. I would almost say for you specifically, I guess, relative to, you know, your studies in neuroscience, is it, would you explain it as more of like a level of intellect, maybe somebody further utilizing aspects of their brain that maybe don't get utilized by the average person, maybe? I don't know.
Yeah, no, that's one way to put it. So from my perspective, you know, what I would consider to be enlightenment, if I were like doing a study, here's how I would define it, or here's how I would anticipate characterizing it, which would be that enlightenment is a combination of certain moral realizations that are consistent across people who are enlightened, right? Caring for others, you know, significant empathy for others, you know, worrying about the experiences of others, like that component. But then it's also a mood-related experience. You know, it's a like
Emotional intellect.
yes, yeah. So it's a specific emotional state that arises along with these other, you know, more sort of moral or cognitive experiences, or more cognitive, you know, just thoughts, right? And it is that combination that produces a state, like a state of consciousness that one could characterize as enlightenment. Whereas, you know, somebody may, you know, really, you know, somebody who's depressed, for example, is experiencing depression, diagnosed with depression, they may very well care deeply about the people in their lives and so on, but I would imagine that it would be difficult to argue that somebody who is, you know, chronically depressed, despite caring for others and having all those empathetic components, is enlightened. You know, and that's not necessarily criticism, right? But, you know, that is not an ideal state, right?
Sure.
So yeah, that's my own, you know, personal perspective. I'm by no means an expert in you know, enlightenment, though. So
Would you ever want to do a study at some point in your life on someone who seemingly has that extreme emotional intelligence or that extreme emotional maturity, and to see the reactions in the brain maybe like that happen when you can, like, I would almost imagine you would put up maybe some frames that might spark an emotional reaction, or show them something that might spark, you know, something in somebody, like, I don't know, like a grandmother dying. I mean, this is horrible, but like a grandmother dying, or, you know, an animal getting, you know, killed in a slaughterhouse or something like that, and to see what happens in the brain relative to that, and how one can keep their composure and their peace inside. Because that, I mean, I would imagine that is something's happening in the brain, you know. For somebody to become aware of their emotions in such a highly intelligent way, for me, I would kind of want to know, just based on my own curiosity, what's going on in the brain, you know, compared to somebody who would have an extreme emotional reaction to something like watching a cow get slaughtered or something like that, you know.
absolutely. I mean, well, so first of all, you know, the studies like that have been conducted, where, you know, we know that there is variability in the emotional experiences one has when they see very evocative pictures or videos, you know, somebody getting hit in the face, or you know, some compared to more sort of like innocuous experiences, like, you know, whatever, just seeing a dog walking, you know, just like that's sort of a pretty neutral experience. And so we know that there's a sort of spectrum of, let's call it empathy. I mean, that is what it is. And, you know, there have even been studies that have sort of begun to map out what structures in the brain are necessary for empathy. But yes, I mean, I think it is, you know, these are the questions that I think are the most seductive to most neuroscientists. Like, you don't get into this game if you don't care about these questions, right? And so, yeah, I would love to participate in that kind of research.
Somebody out here saying, can you wrap it up? I don't want to hog the mic all day. I got one more, if that's okay with you.
Let's do it, man.
Would you think that it's a matter of brain health, or do you think it's a matter of, say, circumstantial life happenings, like maybe the psychology of somebody that, you know, happened to grow up a certain way to reach that level of emotional intelligence? Or do you think it has something to do with the biological aspects of somebody's just healthy brain versus somebody that deals with, you know, maybe some sort of chemical imbalance or something because of, you know, their genes? I don't know.
Yes, and I mean, like it's all of the above for sure. You know, it is both nature and nurture. So, you know, like what one, you know, that's sort of like a maybe overly reductionist framing of what you just brought up, but like, yeah, who you are, your daily experience, your love, your aspirations, your hates, your emotional, your empathy, all of that, your beliefs, your convictions, all of that is a byproduct of both the genes you inherited from your parents that then encode, the physical, a lot of the physical structures of the brain. But the brain is sort of like an adaptation engine, right? So you have this structure, and that structure definitely results in predispositions to things like addiction, or being depressed, or developing post-traumatic stress disorder, or being able to manipulate character representations of the world, like math, for example, right? All of these predispositions exist, but then if you never learn math, then you're never going to be able to exploit those predispositions. And so similarly, like if somebody has been repeatedly traumatized in multiple ways, and they just led this really unfortunate life, yeah, I mean, that is going to result in differences in their subsequent emotional states. I mean, we know that, for example, repeated trauma results in an increased likelihood of experiencing psychosis. And the greater the frequency, the greater the number of bouts of psychosis. And so, these people weren't necessarily born with a brain that will inevitably generate psychosis. It just happens to be this gene-environment interaction, the environment influencing these predispositions that arise from the structures of the brain. So yeah, I mean, I think it's both. It's almost always both in neuroscience. But listen, Duke, man, awesome conversation. Thanks for calling in.
Definitely, man. It's very refreshing to see somebody doing this, and I hope you get on. I just followed you, brother, and it's been wonderful. Love you so much, man. Thank
Awesome.
you.
Likewise. I appreciate it.
All right, bud.
Okay, so I should catch up. So first of all, hello, Eleonora. Good to see you. And thank you very much for, I think, what was the name? Was it Shadowbender? I thought it was Lucid Awareness. Yeah, thank you so much for the super hearts. I really appreciate it. Kind of a great... I don't know if you two know each other, but just kind of interesting that we were talking about lucid dreaming right when you were kind enough to give me a super heart. I appreciate that. Okay, how do I call in? Snappy Pickle. Well, there should be a button towards the bottom there, maybe with two faces. I'm not 100% sure what it'll look like on your phone, like the version you have and stuff like that, but if you hit that little button, it's like next to the button that has the three dots, and then it'll enable you to call in. Oh, but there's somebody calling in right now. Maybe it's you. All right. I love that more people are using their actual names in their handles. It makes life a lot easier. But I understand wanting to maintain anonymity. Believe me, I totally get it. All right, well, hopefully we can connect, Patrick. If it doesn't work, maybe try calling back in, and I'll just jump on it. I'll jump in it. Okay, Shadowbender, of course. You can ask whatever question you like. Hey, Asha, good to see you. Okay. Wow, some of you are having some pretty intense conversations. I'm nervous about benzodiazepines. I have to take Klonopin for anxiety. My brain feels damaged. Okay, so here I'm gonna see if you can call back in, Patrick, because it was taking a long time to connect and failing to. Okay, he has an education. You should try it sometime. Yes, I have a PhD in neuroscience. So nervous about benzodiazepines. I mean, that is healthy. I mean, well, okay, here, Patrick's calling back in. Benzodiazepines after this. Let's see if this connects. Ah, looks like we're connected. Patrick, is that your name? And if so, where are you calling from?
I'm calling from Chicago, Ian.
Awesome. So what's on your mind?
So I have actually studied under Dr. Krauss for quantum mechanics and cosmology.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So I wanted to ask you something by meeting Dr. Shermer as well. His thoughts of business, now happy that I am on the call. He comes into my scopes quite a bit. I wanted to see your thoughts, being a neuroscientist, the need to connect one thing to another, type 1 mental errors, making, if you're familiar, sorry, go ahead. I don't want to...
No, not at all. No, please continue. Please continue.
So the reason I asked about type 1 mental errors is because I have a lot of people that are theists that come into my scopes to discuss myself being an atheist or myself being linked to understanding quantum mechanics and cosmology and asking about the Big Bang and other things like that, and knowing what they know from their holy books, I just wonder, what is it that is the big connection that we're missing here to maybe bridge the gap between what they're thinking reality may be with a deity that has not yet been proven, yet what reality seems to dictate, and kind of what Doug was talking about, or the other caller was talking about even with electrons trying to have an observer effect on something. When you have an observer effect, it does seem to change the effect in which or the effectual case in which the electron is trying to travel. It is doing a different function when being observed. So I'm wondering if that's maybe somehow linked to type 1 mental errors in connecting one thing to another without actual natural connection.
Okay, yeah, let me see if I understand what you're saying, because it's my own fault. I'm being dense here, but okay. So basically, are you basically arguing that, like, people who have a kind of preconceived notion of how the world works, and very important cosmological components of the history of the universe and stuff like that, that therefore the way that new knowledge hits their brain is sort of modified or filtered maybe by those preconceived notions, and so therefore, like, when they are evaluating some new information, like information about the Big Bang, that their perception of it or their understanding of it is inevitably altered such that it serves their preconceived concepts.
Right.
Is that what you mean?
Correct. Absolutely. Because we know that mentally back in with our ancestors on the savannas of Africa, we know that they were just trying to survive and not get eaten.
Right.
So they know that if there was as Dr. Sherman puts it, if there's a rustle of wind through a brush, and you perceive that it's a dangerous predator, and you go and hide, you've tried to hide so you can live and reproduce. The other ones that think it's just the wind and it's a predator, they get eaten, right? So they don't reproduce. And so that's what we're descendants of. So what I'm saying is, if you're linking one thing to another, and you're taught to link one thing to another just genetically, it's just in your makeup already, and then I come along and say, well, by the way, just so you know, there is a theory about something coming from nothing, and it doesn't filter through their brains that that's even a possibility other than a deity doing it. I just wonder how to reach those people other than when they're not willing to do research themselves. When I do also cite sources, I'm wondering, how do I get through to them without them going and searching themselves?
Yeah. No, I know exactly what you mean. Yeah. So, all right. I think I understand a bit better. Well, first of all, I agree that I agree with you that having those prior beliefs about any given topic will influence subsequent exposures to alternative explanations. That's inevitable. But, like, if your goal is to be more convincing, basically, there's a couple things that we know about human psychology with regards to disagreement or mutually exclusive kind of explanations. First of all, humans are totally capable of cognitive dissonance, right? You can totally have two contradictory beliefs at the same time, right? That happens all the time. So you may not, and frankly, I think it happens a lot in science, in neuroscience. So there's that. Like, we're not working with a perfect, rationality machine here. But then, the second is that, generally speaking, and this is true in multiple domains of discourse, be it politics or anything like psychology, where, generally speaking, presenting somebody with a lot of information does not generate the intended consequence of that information. And very frequently, it produces the opposite reaction, where people become more, for lack of a better term, stubborn, like they're more obstinate. And So, if I had an ideal, optimal strategy to convince, people of things, I would probably be a billionaire by now, I wish I had a more substantive answer for that topic, but I think that is at least a useful insight, right? When you're talking about things that, may contradict somebody's, deeply held spiritual beliefs. I guess like one thing that I think is meaningful is that like a lot of these beliefs, I think we talk about them as though they're in a vacuum. Like, you believe that evolution by natural selection explains the emergence of human consciousness, right? That belief has a valence to it, right? Where it has an emotional relevance, right? Where you're not just talking about, chess pieces on a chessboard. You're talking about, very deeply rooted emotional reactions to contradicting, and any contradiction of that will elicit a very severe emotional response. So anything you can do to kind of mitigate that response, and some of these feelings are some of the worst, or most powerfully motivating ones, like shame, for example, or guilt, tribal affiliation, that kind of thing. And so anything you can do to sort of mitigate that reaction, and there's probably many ways to do it, I think would serve your purpose. And then, another thing is like providing somebody with the ability to kind of forgive themselves, right? With like the ability to not feel like, whatever, I've wasted my life, or this is what my parents, whom I love more than anybody in the world, this is what they believe, giving somebody the kind of the rational equation that would enable them to escape those reactions, I think would serve your purpose. I don't know how to do that, but yeah.
I'm working on a way to, heads hello, sorry, in the comments. The last thing, and I want to let you get to other callers as well, and I want to make sure that your show runs smoothly, so last thing is making sure that you are a professor, so to speak, in a way that you mentally take in information that may be harder for people to understand, yet at the same time you find a way to not dumb it down, but make it to where they understand it. You come to where they're at in a way that your explanation goes, okay, this is how I understand this now, and that's why I try to push, and like you said about believing something, I try to say what is less or more likely, obviously, but at the same time, saying belief versus, we all believe something, so let's make it a push, and that is the one thing that I'm trying to avoid in all of my scopes, because I want them to understand it is not a push, because there's actual evidence backing up one. So I'm trying to make sure that they're not on equal footing yet, but it's okay if there's not seemingly a purpose, because I feel that the intrinsic, the nature of Homo sapiens now is to say, we want to feel a purpose to something, therefore we feel happy, we feel like we're driven towards an end goal. Here's the difference. There's a difference between a God-given purpose and your personal driven purpose. What are you trying to make of your own lifespan while you're here? That is what I try to encourage people to do. Like yourself, I'm sure you have a purpose that in your own head that you're driving towards, you're trying to accomplish, and I would think that would be more fulfilling because you're doing it rather than saying, well, I have to wait until someone else tells me what it is so that I can be motivated again.
I see. Yeah, right. That's no disagreement there.
I appreciate you, and I am following you, sir, and I appreciate you letting me up here.
No, it's my pleasure. Thanks for calling in. Interesting conversation.
Right.
Take it easy. Sir. Geez, some really intense and deep conversations today. There's something about, just today. It's funny that I think it was Duke brought up dreaming. I've been having like some of the most vivid dreams of my life during this, sheltering in place. Maybe some of that monotony has something to do with it. All right, let me get to some comments, because I've basically just been on the phone. Is money your motivation? It is not. No, because if money were my motivation, I would have a very different job right now. And it would be much more lucrative. Much more. The better a person's understanding of science, the less magical their thinking. Double-mindedness is ancient as humans. Double-minded, you mean like cognitive dissonance? Yeah, totally. Cognitive dissonance is a huge factor for how our society is run, totally. Yeah. How can you rewire pathways? It's benzodiazepines. So, yeah, I mean, it is worth being worried about chronic use of benzodiazepines. They are a very, very useful tool. They used to be prescribed, way more for more conditions than they are now, because it has now been more widely appreciated that benzodiazepines are very powerfully, very rapidly develops cognitive substance dependence, and in some cases can be addiction. And a lot of substances create substance dependence. But the difference is that with benzodiazepines, that substance dependence can produce potentially fatal outcomes when one stops taking them. So your worry is justified. However, that does not mean that there is no light at the end of the tunnel. There is a solution available to you. If you reach out to a physician, maybe just your primary care physician, they'll be able to connect you with maybe a specialist in addiction medicine, or in or maybe that physician themselves have experience weaning somebody off benzodiazepines, presumably if they've presumed the benzodiazepine. They don't necessarily have to be the one, but if they have, then they would have some experience with that. But even if you're using Klonopin just recreationally, right? Then you can still pursue this clinical assistance, and you really, really should. Because not only is there a specific strategy to weaning somebody off benzodiazepines to avoid those negative, those potentially fatal outcomes, but also minimizing the emotional and sort of withdrawal syndrome that tends to promote relapse. But then also they can also prescribe other medications that aren't habit forming but do mitigate the severity of those withdrawal symptoms. So yeah, you should totally do that. I mean, it's good to care about this, and it's good to treat it without any kind of triviality. But there's a solution, and you just have to sort of buckle down and pursue some clinical assistance. You look amazing with a mullet. I'm well on my way, man. I haven't had a haircut in like 6 months. A scientist shouldn't be so rigid, shouldn't be psycho-rigid. I'm certainly not. In fact, I 100% agree with you. I think, to be a good scientist, you have to be open-minded. You have to be willing to accept new information and adapt, even if it directly contradicts your own hypotheses, right? I'm talking more specifically on, it's like the research I do and the hypotheses, the theories that I have about the way this specific brain region works. Well, if somebody produces a body of evidence that demonstrates that my theory is incorrect, I have to accept that. I think it's an underappreciated component of what science is, or what it's like to do science. That I think people see scientists as very rigid and 100%, not interested in any kind of alternative explanation. No, that it is intrinsic to science to being willing to accept new data, new evidence, and adjusting your framework, your theoretical framework. Otherwise, we wouldn't make any discoveries. So totally. To recircuit a brain, because I've heard that a brain is just one big circuit. Yeah, kind of. I mean, it sort of is. It's not just one circuit, really, though. But I mean, if you want to get really generous with how you're defining circuit, then yeah, it is. So how to recircuit a brain? Well, believe it or not, it's happening right now, and you don't need to do anything about it. It's just automatic. It comes included in the package of having a brain, is that it adapts to it adapts over time, and new synapses, which are the point of communication between neurons, the most important, I think, or not. Glia are also very, very important. I'm just kidding. In fact, we just talked about a study that demonstrates how important glia are to people who have migraines. But the point of communication between neurons, it's called the synapse. Your brain is constantly generating new ones, getting rid of old ones. And in fact, in some parts of the brain, new neurons are being generated, even well into adulthood. Like in the dentate gyrus of the hippocampus, for example, or interneurons in the striatum. This happens in adult brains. For the longest time, it was sort of dogma. Well, here you go. Here's an example of scientists accepting new evidence. It was dogma that after your brain has finished developing through childhood, that's it. The neurons you got are the neurons you got, and neurons are going to be some of the oldest cells in your body, meaning like they're there forever, and well, until your demise, and that's it. But no, there now has been evidence that demonstrates that neurogenesis, the creation of new neurons, occurs in some parts of the adult brain, and so that is the new dogma, right? Another example of that is, for the longest time, the brain is what we call immunoprivileged, meaning that the immune system doesn't, engage the central nervous system in the same way that it does other parts of the body. There's a couple parts of the body that are immunoprivileged, but they're the minority. So the brain is one, the eyes are another, and the reproductive organs are another, like testicles. And this has to do with like how blood vessels are arranged, but it turns out fairly recently it has been shown that no, the immune system does influence the brain. And in fact, there is a great study that showed that the meninges, which are the sort of like outer layers of the brain, sort of like shrink wrap, have a lot of a certain kind of T cell, delta gamma T cell, that release a immune system molecule called interleukin 17. Don't worry about any of these words, but basically it's like these immune cells are surrounding the brain, and it turned out their evidence showed that if you manipulate that immune system cell, again that's sort of around the brain, not inside but around, and you therefore manipulate levels of that immune system molecule, you can manipulate behavior. Animals will behave in ways that are indicative of much lower anxiety if you just get rid of that stuff. So that's the immune system affecting behavior. Not only just affecting how neurons or the activity of neurons, but animal behavior. So, it's more of like a global effect. Dogma changes. Scientists then, accept, oh, hey, okay, so then the immune system is playing a very important role, or it can, role in guiding behavior. And so it's, we have to either redefine what we mean by immunoprivileged, or we have to redefine how we perceive the relationship between the central nervous system and the immune system. So we're not rigid thinkers, believe it or not. In fact, I would be willing to bet scientists, just across the board, in general, tend to be the least stubborn relative to other professions like lawyers or doctors. Physicians. If you want to meet a stubborn person, go meet a physician. I mean, yeah, scientists are not stubborn in that same way. I mean, well, good scientists. It's a big field. Why is it that you can't remember someone's name but remember everything about them? Yeah, isn't that interesting? Well, first of all, there are different kinds of information, different kinds of memory. So it is a different exercise to remember a name than it is to remember their face. Literally, different parts of the brain underlie those capabilities. Facial perception in particular, but you can remember what they were wearing. You can remember your emotional kind of associations that you have with this person. Do you hate this person? Do you love them? Do you find them attractive? Do you can remember all of that stuff, but then remembering their name, that's just like sort of a declarative, it's just a word, right? And so, memory is weird that way. Memory is very multifaceted, and it's far more complicated than just one kind. So another thing is verbal activity, like language, something that we call verbal recall, where, we don't know precisely how it is that I am selecting the next words that I'm going to say. I have no idea what the next word I'm going to say will be, but it happens, fortunately for me, right? Otherwise, this would be a pretty boring conversation if I was just sitting here busy not picking words. But anyways, one way that it may happen is, you have so many potential words that you could say at any given moment, in any position in a given sentence. So many. Why am I not saying, scotoma, or why am I not saying Tacoma, or whatever? Like, why am I not saying those words? Well, I know those words. They're equally good. There's nothing intrinsically better about me saying this word, the word, than scotoma or Tacoma. But, obviously meaning plays a role. I'm trying to convey a certain thought. So there's this selection process that your brain does to select the word that is both the most available to you in that moment, but then also that and would satisfy your motivation. And so one way that happens is kind of similar to the way movement is actually regulated in the brain, like movement, like your ability to touch your nose or whatever, move. And that is that basically the brain sends out a blast of movement, orders. And then eventually, mostly in the spinal cord, what happens is that all of that blast is then just like narrowed down to just the one specific signal that you want to do. So like it was really interesting to watch this develop in my baby, where babies don't really have good manual dexterity when they're quite young. Like they're just sort of like, they don't have good dexterity. They're very, very clumsy. But what you can see is that they just don't have that mechanism yet. It hasn't developed that mechanism to inhibit everything other than the one, than to move this finger. It's more just like move hand, and then there's that filter isn't available yet, and so it's just like they just bat things. Fortunately, she's developed the ability to do stuff with her fingers, and let me tell you, it's pretty irritating. Particularly if we haven't clipped her nails, and she hates when we clip her nails. But anyways, so word selection may work very similarly, where what happens is that you have this pool of reasonable words that you might select, and they're all put forth, and then there's a selection process that then narrows in on the right word. But the problem is that because the brain isn't perfect, constantly makes mistakes. In fact, it evolved on the premise that it makes mistakes to learn from those mistakes. It anticipates that mistakes will be made, and then it compares outcome of an action to the intended action, and then that difference is meaningful and instructive. But so what can happen is that the brain is inhibiting the right word, favoring this other word, right? I'm sure this happens to everybody. Tip of the tongue syndrome. I think Presque-Vu is the no, it's not Presque-Vu. What is it? I always forget the déjà vu-esque term for it. But basically, it's that the brain is inhibiting the word that you want to use, and it's saying, no, this one. Look over here. Say Tacoma. No, but I want to say scotoma. But all I can think of is Tacoma. And until you relieve that filtration process and free up those words once again, your brain is going to consistently inhibit the word you want. So, long explanation, but yeah. Cheetah hide looks lovely on bedside tables. Cheetah hide? Cool. Okay, interesting stuff. I wonder if epigenetic factors have to do with something like that. Damn, I wish I remember at what point this was in our conversation. But yes, almost always yes. If anybody's unfamiliar, epigenetics, if anybody's interested in going into biomedical science, particularly neuroscience, epigenetics in the context of neuroscience is already a critically important field, but it is the source of a lot of challenges to sort of paradigms of the relationship between genetics and behavior. I can give you an example. Like one quick example is, of course, now I'm literally doing what I just explained. I'm inhibiting the right. Lamarckian evolution, or Lamarckian genesis, suggested that the way inheritance works is you are affected in your life in some way, and then when you reproduce, that experience directly translates to your offspring. So it's kind of a clumsy way to phrase it, but it's like if you were to lose your hand, then your baby will not have a hand. I mean, I don't think that was actually part of the theory, the hypothesis, but you can think of it that way, right? Where experience transmits intergenerationally, and then Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace set us straight and helped us to understand the mechanisms of evolution and natural selection, that is, and then so for ever since then, pretty much it was, experience does not influence reproduction or intergenerational transmission, because if you're a female, you're born with all the eggs that you're going to have, basically, and if you're a man, then you're constantly generating more sperm, but the genes that are included in those germ cells and those reproductive cells are not affected. So the paradigm goes, are not affected by life, unless you're exposed to some kind of radiation or some kind of mutagen that directly, intervenes and directly manipulates those cells' genomes, those gametes. Otherwise, they're immutable. They are the genes and they are dictated by the genes that you inherited from your mom and your dad, from your parents, right? some studies some of which were done at the University of Pennsylvania, where I got my PhD, from the lab of somebody who was on my dissertation committee, and she was brutal. She's brilliant, Julie Blendy. I think she's the chair of pharmacology, actually, but she does a lot of neuroscience. Anyways, her lab was interested in whether or not sensory experiences can translate to changes in behavior intergenerationally. Okay, so here's what they did. You have a group of mice. Mice are very olfactorily driven. Humans are very visually driven, assuming you have an intact visual system. Mice are even more olfactorily driven by scent and smell and taste and stuff like that. They're much better smellers than we are. And their eyesight isn't very good. Anyways, so you take this group of mice, both male mice and female mice, and you expose some of them to an aversive environment, an environment that they don't like a very, very bright environment, a very sort of like harsh environment, not a lot of like bedding and fun stuff like that, or comfy stuff like that. No security areas, no like way to hide and stuff like that. They just feel very, very exposed and therefore very, very anxious, right? They evolved to avoid predators, which typically come from above, right, in the form of birds. And so being bright and being in wide open spaces, terrible. And then what the scientists did is they exposed them to odorants like peppermint or things like that. I think they might have used peppermint. And so, and the mice are trained such that whenever they're in this very aversive environment, and there's different things you can do, right? You can like restrain them for a little while. They really don't like that because who does? But no matter what, this aversive experience is coupled with a scent. Okay, then they breed. They mate, right? They make babies. And I don't know why I was like so vehemently trying to explain what I meant by breed. But anyways, they have offspring. And, I'm sorry, before they mate, the scientists measure the effects of just exposure to the odorant. They're in their home cage, they're just chilling, they're living their fluffy tail and being normal, happy mice. And then the scientists expose them to a little bit of peppermint smell. And all of a sudden they have this aversive reaction, even though they're not in that aversive environment, right? So in the brain of these mice, peppermint means something bad. Whenever they smell peppermint, they have this aversive reaction, anxiety, stuff like that. Okay, then they mate, they breed, they generate offspring. And then the scientists, their kids grow up, the babies, they grow up into adult mice, or probably adolescent mice, and then they evaluate, okay, is there any effect on these mice who have never been exposed, never had any kind of coupling between peppermint and an aversive environment? They test to see how do these mice react to peppermint. And it turned out that they would have aversive reactions. So once again, they've never had peppermint coupled to being exposed, being anxious, being confined. They've never been exposed to that. And they've never been exposed to peppermint. And it turns out that the offspring of mice that did the offspring, had an anxiety response, had an aversive reaction to the scent, to the novel scent. Not only that, not only just one generation, but multiple generations. This was somehow transmitted. Now, there's a debate going on, very, very contentious debate between some very senior scientists, including the one that was on my thesis committee and dissertation committee, Julie Blendy, and then another very, very senior, very well-regarded scientist named Eric Nestler. I think he used to be the head of NIDA. No. He was the head of SFN for a year. And, the debate is whether or not it is epigenetics that's enabling this pseudo-Lamarckian transmission of characteristics, or if there are just subtle components of behavior that we just can't pick up on, right? These parents are, rearing their offspring. Now, there have been some other studies. I've been going on about this for too long. There are some other studies that do kind of help to scrutinize that. But yeah, so that's epigenetics. I'm sorry. I think that's a really, really cool topic. COVID-19 effects on the brain. Great topic. Short answer is we don't really know if there's a direct effect of the virus, SARS-CoV-2, that causes COVID-19 and the nervous system. Okay. However, there is enough evidence at this point, and I talked to my old PI, my old boss, mentor, very, very senior neuroscientist, and I've talked to other neuroscientists, and this was a couple months ago. Like this was around when it turned out that there's this consistent effect where people become anosmic. They lose the ability to smell, to detect smell, and sometimes taste as well. And so that was like a curious outcome. I think I talked about this last week, but that's curious. But in my mind, it's like, this is a respiratory virus, so it's like, duh. Like, if you ever had the flu or a cold or allergies and your nose is all swollen and leaky and stuff, your smell just doesn't really work right. So it's like, that's not a big deal. It's not necessarily evidence that there's a neurological component to this, but however, now there's plenty of evidence suggesting that yes, there is a neurological component to COVID-19. People have had strokes, people have had seizures, people have, obviously there's tremendous fatigue in some people. And not only that, but given the fact that there are, long-termers where people continue to have symptoms of COVID-19 for months, in some cases 6 months, and counting, and long haulers, right. I think that, in I think it was Italy or it might have been France, one of the hospitals, both countries got hit pretty hard a bit earlier than the United States. There was a hospital that set up a ward strictly devoted to COVID-19 patients with neurological symptoms. So yeah, I mean, like I said last time, I think we're going to learn a lot about this virus that show us your brain, bro. I would if I could. Oh wait, where is my? Oh, it's outside. Sorry. I do have a brain. Believe it or not, I do have a brain. Yeah, I think we're going to learn a lot about this virus. And if you're interested in what I think is the explanation for why it is that some patients don't have neurological symptoms. Some patients barely have symptoms at all. Some patients have the most severe symptoms in the world. Obviously, some patients pass away. What's the deal with that? Why is it so variable? Are some people asymptomatic and some people, their life has changed forever? There is this sequence on the virus. The virus is a very simple, string of genetic information, basically. SARS-CoV-2 happens to be pretty big relative to other kind of comparable viruses, but there are no viruses that are that gigantic, except for giant viruses, which are one of the coolest topics in the world, in my opinion. They sort of blur the lines between what we consider to be life and not life. Anyways, there's this sequence in SARS-CoV-2. It's called a furin recognition sequence, where I guess it's a protease, right? An enzyme essentially recognizes this sequence and interacts with the virus in such a way as to make it viable. Well, this sequence in SARS-CoV-2 is different than the one in SARS-CoV-1, which caused SARS, and it may be the reason that SARS-CoV-2 can interact with such a wide swath of human biology. That's why you get people, who have, some kind of clotting pathology, whereas some people don't. Or you have, organ failure, kidney failure, liver failure, and some patients don't. And I'd be willing to bet my Bitcoin, which I don't have a lot of it, to be clear, but that there will be short nucleotide polymorphisms in the enzymes that we have, those enzymes that recognize those sequences in the virus, that can help to explain at least part of the reason for why some people seem to be vulnerable to such a greater severity of disease than others. Whoa, I missed a lot on YouTube. Sorry about that, everybody. I have a YouTube channel. It's called youtube.com/anthropoid. Today I talked about a bunch of cool stuff. I talked about how it is that the brain can perceive the passage of time. It's pretty neat. And I talked about a bunch of stuff. A new potential cause of migraine, a relationship between COVID-19 and addiction, substance use disorder. Let's see, will this work? All right. Looks like we're connected. So what's your name and where are you calling from?
Hey, this is Chris. I'm calling from California. How are you doing today?
Awesome. I'm doing well. How about you?
I'm doing the same. You took my word. I was going to use the same word, awesome, but the reason why it's awesome is because what happens before awesome, and that's what I was talking about, what happens before it, and that's just a glorious position. So, but yeah, I'm
All right, what's on your mind, man?
Nothing. I was just kind of just wanted to jump in and just see what's up, and you know, when the typing just doesn't work for me for some reason. I'm not sure if it's just because that's the way I was raised. You know, I just wasn't typing skills weren't my thing, and I had other things in mind. So I might be a different cut of cloth if I was, and I am. I guess I bring something to the table, anyways.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, man, I mean, feel free to call back in if anything, pops into your mind, and we'll chat.
I'm just saying, right now, like right now, we just keep going, because I'm just trying to feel you a little bit, because you want me to feel you, because the way you speak would demand that people feel you, right? Because they're going to reflect what you're projecting. I don't know if you're into that or not, but I am.
I suppose so, but I imagine there are people that, have like a specific thing that they'd like to bring up. So I'm going to let you go, and feel free to call back in if something comes up. Thanks for calling, man.
Thanks, man.
Oh, and we have another call. Wow, a lot of callers today, huh? That's awesome. I think it makes it more fun when you can actually hear somebody's voice. All right, it looks like we're connected. What's your name and where are you calling from?
Hello, my name's Jeff, and I'm calling from California.
Jack in California? Okay, what's on your mind?
Jeff.
Oh, Jeff, sorry about that. What's on your mind?
I want to know what it is exactly what you do.
Sure. Okay. I finished up my PhD in neuroscience at the end of last year, and I am now working as a science advisor to the state of New Jersey.
Wow. So, does most of your day consist of paperwork and meetings, or actual surgeries?
Okay, well, so when I was working on my PhD, it barely consisted of paperwork. And yeah, so I would do viral infusions into specific parts of the brain, targeting very specific parts, very small. So yeah, that was the majority of my time. I also spent a lot of time at the microscope. I did a lot of what we call microscopy, where I'm trying to find out where in the brain my viruses landed, what changed in the brain as a result of them. And then I did a lot of, immunohistochemistry. So yeah, I actually spent probably far less time than a lot of other PhDs in neuroscience, even touching paper.
Is that because you got lucky, or is that how it usually is supposed to be?
It just totally depends on the project you choose, right? Or the projects you end up pursuing. Like, for example, there are neuroscientists who do all of their work basically is programming. It's like evaluating data, so they can do most of their PhD from home. They're just writing code essentially. There are some neuroscience PhDs who only do like molecular biology. So it's a lot of pipetting. It's a lot of like moving small fluids around basically. And then there are some neuroscientists that work with primates. They work with monkeys. And so their days spent, hanging out with non-human primates. So it's a very, very diverse field. It just depends on what you choose.
So that sounds like a lot more research stuff. I thought for a second you were like a surgeon to like humans. But
No.
what are the kind of stuff that you have to reconsider when working with primate brains?
Okay, sure. I mean, so obviously the primate brain is non-human primate brain is the most similar to the human brain. Humans, after all, are primates, and so they are like an ideal way to get an idea of what's going on in a human brain. However, because of that similarity, non-human primates are capable of more components of human consciousness than any other animal. So they can experience depression, in a way that is more akin to what humans experience, or they can experience disappointment, and like the emotional component of pain is more similar to that of humans. So essentially, your concern, the concern with which you treat non-human primates is the same as you would give to a human, essentially. So yeah, but there are some subtle anatomical differences, obviously, that distinguish, let's say, a chimpanzee brain from a human brain. And so you have to be worried about that, too, when you're interpreting how a monkey or how a non-human primate reacts to in any given experimental situation.
That's awesome. How soon do you want to apply your research to humans?
So my research was focused on trying to understand if there's a part of the brain, first of all, that we know regulates the withdrawal syndrome, the negative experiences one has when they've been smoking for a long time, drinking alcohol for a long time, or doing opioids like more heroin. So, when people stop doing those drugs after having done them for a while, they have withdrawal. It's very, very unpleasant. And it turns out that the circuit that I was studying, activity in that circuit seems to be required for the manifestation of all of those symptoms. But not only that, my research suggests that it also is involved in anxiety, right? In perhaps pathological anxiety that people experience, at inappropriate times that can be crippling. And so, that is some pretty early stage. It's what we call very, basic or fundamental neuroscience research. It's more translational, meaning it's more likely to be used or meaningful in a treatment, a clinical setting than other neuroscience. But, basically the broad goal of my project would be to, if it's true that this circuit is involved in all those withdrawal from all those drugs, and if it's true that it is involved in anxiety, there are unique receptors that, bind neurotransmitters that are only on that circuit, meaning you could develop a drug that would selectively target this circuit rather than target all of this stuff that you don't even want it to touch, which is the problem with most psychiatric drugs. So that would be in a while, right? It would take a long time, but on the order of like a decade or something like that.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing what it is exactly that you do and what your hopes are for your science.
It's my pleasure. Thanks so much for calling in.
Thank you.
All right. I totally thought that person was going to be a troll. The whole time I was just like, when are you going to start trolling? Whoops. Okay, so for YouTube, my friend Melinda tells me to live in the present. I say we should be oriented towards the future. Who is right? Do blind and dead people perceive time the same way as people without these disabilities? So first of all, yeah, I agree. I think I tend to live in the future way too much, which is kind of a problem because you can begin to feel like you're always just preparing for some future thing that may or may not ever happen, rather than appreciating the present. Having a baby definitely forces you to live in the present more. Okay, and then do blind and dead people, but I assume you meant deaf people, perceive time the same way as people without these disabilities? It's an interesting question. I mean, it has been evaluated. I don't remember the outcomes, but I think that the conclusion was yes, pretty much. And obviously, so the reason that time is coming up, well, maybe it's just spontaneously getting there, but like on YouTube, I have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/anthropoid. Just click on the subscribe button. Don't have to smash it. I don't want you to break your computer. Just click it. You can smash it if you want to smash it. I'm not going to tell you not to, okay? But anyways, I talked about a part of the brain that seems to enable us to perceive time. So yeah. So yeah, I'm pretty sure. But the issue is that there are different sort of modalities that are related to time, right? Like that you can use to measure time, right? Like rhythmicity. So like, me snapping my fingers, right? This is at a specific interval, and the paper that we were talking about was mostly about how it is or what happens in the brain as I keep doing this. At a certain point, it'll stop mattering to you. Like you might even forget I'm even doing it, right? But what you're doing is you're seeing and hearing me snapping my fingers. And so a certain part of the brain activity begins to attenuate. But then if I start just like messing around with that rhythm, all of a sudden that brain region becomes active once again. Okay. So that's why we brought it up. But anyway, yeah, so there's like a visual component to what was just happening. You've seen me snap my fingers. So somebody who's deaf would be able to, get a sense that, hey, he's snapping his fingers. I don't hear it, but I can see that he's snapping his fingers. Likewise, for somebody who's blind, they can hear me snapping my fingers, probably a little bit better than me. But they don't have the visual component. But so like if I'm snapping my fingers off, the screen, you don't know when I'm doing it by watching, so you have to have the auditory input to know. And so, that would be the difference, right? Is that they, just some some sensory modalities are unavailable to them. So that would be the difference. How does hypnosis play in with what you've been discussing? So hypnosis is interesting. Hypnosis, obviously a very contentious field or subject, because there are some, charlatans that do hypnosis. I mean, I don't think that is particularly controversial to suggest, where they say that they can, make people, uncontrollably squawk like a chicken and all that kind of stuff. There's no evidence to suggest that that's real. That's just performative. There's a lot of interesting psychology underlying that. However, there is evidence that hypnosis can be helpful for certain in certain circumstances. Like, for example, when people are trying to quit smoking. Nicotine, cigarettes are among the most addictive drugs, despite the fact that they're not particularly pleasurable or rewarding. And, cessation or quitting rates are very, very low. And relapse rates are very, very high for cigarettes and smoking. It's so low that the way we measure success in trying to kick that habit is just how long you were able to hold out before you relapsed. Okay. And so, so we're constantly working on, that was part of why I was working in my project, constantly trying to find new treatments for addiction, specifically to cigarettes. Cigarettes also worldwide are essentially the leading cause of preventable death still. And they're still among the highest, one of the causes of the highest preventable death in the United States, despite the fact that something like, this was shocking to me, something like very a low percentage of the country still smokes cigarettes. And in fact, there's like 19, arguably 20 states where state-regulated casinos must outlaw smoking. I just worked on a topic related to this. There's way more states than I thought. That would, casinos of all places, right? Anyways, it turns out, or at least there's some studies that suggest that for some folks who underwent hypnosis treatment as a cessation aid, like as a thing to help them quit smoking, tended to be abstinent for longer, that tended to stay clean for longer. I don't know if you can hear my daughter in the background. She just went, pizza. Anyways, then people who didn't undergo that hypnosis treatment. The issue, however, is that we don't know what the active ingredient of hypnosis really is. We don't know if it's the actual specifically being hypnotized. There is a unique pattern brain activity when somebody's technically hypnotized. Or if it's just the fact, it's not like somebody hypnotizes a person and then just like leaves them sitting there, right? There's like talk therapy, the equivalent of talk therapy that goes on when, as a component of hypnosis. It could just very well be that therapy in and of itself, for somebody who's calm and maybe a little bit more suggestible, maybe a little bit more amenable to outside influence, it's just a form of psychotherapy. That just so happens to use this modality, this treatment, as a way to calm somebody down. We don't know the answer to that, but there's something to it, all right. Oh, geez, how long have I been on? I should probably call it. What's 4:20? Let's see if there's anything else. My boyfriend kicked his 25-year smoking habit with hypnosis. So unbelievably wonderful. Oh, how about that? Yeah, that's interesting. Congratulations. 25 years is a long time. My dad used to smoke, and he used to smoke a lot. Like, he used to smoke like 3 packs a day. One day, I think my older sister was, totally guilted him and was just like, you're, not going to do this anymore. And my dad just like one day just kicked it, went cold turkey, totally kicked it, which is nuts. I mean, like, that is not the common thing that happens. But, however, we know. And so I think I know that he has a certain single nucleotide polymorphism, or SNP, in a subunit of the receptor that nicotine binds, nicotinic acetylcholine receptor, one of the ones that I studied, in fact, because it turns out that if you have a certain unique sequence to that receptor subtype, that component of the receptor, this receptor looks sort of like a pentagon, and like imagine like a column holding up a pentagon at every corner. That's kind of that. It's a pentameric receptor, meaning it has like 5 subunits. And so if I know that you have a specific sequence of one of those subunits, I can predict whether you smoke. I can predict when you started smoking. I can predict how much you smoke. And I can predict how severe your withdrawal syndrome is going to be. In other words, some people
who are able to find nicotine rewarding in the first place. Not everybody does. Some people have a genetic predisposition to experiencing a more severe withdrawal syndrome than others. And I think my dad just happens to, have that SNP that enables him to, just the withdrawal isn't as severe. But the same thing, that same exact single nucleotide polymorphism, that unique genetic sequence, also happens to enable organisms, animals, humans, to consume way more nicotine than somebody without it would ever want to. Because at a certain point, nicotine becomes aversive. Like at a certain dose, you can overdose on nicotine. You get nauseous, you get sweaty, you get dizzy, and you just feel terrible, right? And so generally speaking, people will sort of like self-titrate their nicotine dose by, they're not smoking like 4 cigarettes at a time, all day, right? They'll smoke to sort of achieve this dose and then just sort of hover around there. While people with this SNP will tend to, that dose can be so much higher because they just don't experience that negative activity or that aversive activity. And so as a result, their chemical dependence can be more severe, right? Because they've taken in 3 packs of cigarettes a day. And, keep in mind, this is back in the days when there were no filters or anything like that on cigarettes. Kind of blows my mind that he did that, or he could do that. But that indicates to me that he, and then therefore probably I, have that single nucleotide polymorphism, and it makes sense. Okay, I'm gonna stop talking about this. Can you tell if this had to do with my PhD? But awesome, congrats. It's not easy to quit smoking. Okay, that's another thing that my daughter says. And then let's see, because I say that absentmindedly when I'm like opening the refrigerator or, picking a Sesame Street episode. I go like, let's see. And so she just like exaggerates it. It's adorable. Anyways, I should probably call it a day there. I'm sorry. I would love to stay on for longer. I'd love this. Being able to communicate with people outside of the confines of this apartment without a mask on, so I can actually see or that you can actually see the lower part of my face. I think there is something nutritious to that, I think. And it's in real time. It's not pre-recorded. Am I British? No, I'm American. Not that there's anything wrong with being British, but I don't know why somebody would anticipate that I am. Anyways, yeah, so I really appreciate it, but I have to get back to the girls. I have to relieve my wife of mom duty. Anyway, so I have a YouTube channel. It's youtube.com/anthropoid. I spend the first few, first like 20, actually today is a bit longer, like 40 minutes talking about a specific topic. And in today, that was the relationship or the way that the brain can encode the passage of time. But I also talked about a study that came out suggesting that there might be some there is a correlation, and there might be some relationship between substance use disorder, addiction, and COVID-19. And I talked about some of the details of that. What else did I talk? I talked about a new potential cause of migraine, potentially yielding a new treatment for migraine. I talked about a lot of stuff today. So check it out, youtube.com/anthropoid. Just click on the subscribe button. Once again, don't smash it. Don't smash it. I have a podcast called Wired to be Weird. And I talk about a lot of these topics that we talked about today on there. With that, I guess I will call it a day. Thank you so much for joining. Hopefully next week I'll see you same time, same place. See you there. Wear your mask. See y'all. All right, YouTube, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it, as always. And as always, I'm totally open to any input you have for me on how to make this better or more useful for you. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe. I would appreciate it. Otherwise, see you next week. Have a great beginning of your week.